Thank you for joining me today. I want to begin with a moment of stark realism. What was once presented by Moscow as an unbreakable logistical lifeline, the Crimean land bridge, is now in effect collapsing. And as that bridge falters, ordinary Russians are fleeing Crimea, caught in a deeply consequential gasoline crisis that is no longer an abstract geopolitical issue, but a crisis on their streets. Moscow's so-called Crimea land bridge was long presented as a triumph of engineering, a strategic artery designed to bind Crimea to the Russian mainland both physically and politically. Yet today, that once glorified link is deteriorating under the weight of military pressure, logistical breakdowns, and internal strain. The collapse is not merely structural, it is symbolic, exposing the fragility of a narrative that Russia has defended for years. What was supposed to be an unshakable lifeline has turned into a glaring vulnerability. And here lies the hook. When a government's strongest symbol becomes its weakest point, the political consequences can be profound. The weakening of the land bridge represents far more than the disruption of traffic or the slowing of supply trucks. It signals that Moscow's hold over Crimea, long advertised as permanent and immutable, is encountering its most serious test since the annexation. The infrastructure that once served as a visual and practical guarantee of Russia's presence is now a battlefield of strategic pressure. Every delay, every bottleneck, every damaged segment becomes a reminder that control over territory is not defined by declarations, but by the capacity to maintain stable life for those who live there. At the moment, that capacity is slipping. Compounding the issue is the psychological dimension. For years, the land bridge was used as a political instrument, a message to both the international community and the residents of Crimea that Russia possessed the logistical backbone to sustain the region indefinitely. Today, however, the erosion of that link sends an entirely different message. Instability is not at the borders. It is at the heart of Moscow's strategic infrastructure. And when the narrative of stability falters, people begin to question the security of their future in the region. This deteriorating situation has produced a ripple effect, impacting civilian confidence, military logistics, and broader political perceptions. Supply disruptions highlight how dependent Crimea is on a single overworked and overstretched route. Any interruption carries disproportionate consequences, reinforcing the impression that Moscow is struggling to manage the territory it fought so hard to claim. The hook here is stark. A bridge once built to demonstrate dominance is now revealing dependence, and dependence is not the language of power. Ultimately, the unraveling of the so-called land bridge represents a turning point in the geopolitical story of Crimea. It signals a shift from confident expansion to defensive maintenance, from projecting strength to scrambling for stability, and in the realm of politics, perception can be as consequential as reality. The gasoline crisis unfolding in Crimea has become one of the most visible signs of the region's growing instability, transforming what might appear at first as a routine supply issue into a full-scale disruption of daily life. Gas stations across the peninsula are closing their pumps, restricting sales, or running out of fuel entirely, leaving drivers in long, winding lines with no certainty of whether they will receive even a few liters. The government's move to ration gasoline, limiting each driver to a strict minimal amount, has only intensified public frustration and highlighted the severity of the shortage. And here lies the hook. When a society can no longer rely on something as basic as fuel, the crisis stops being logistical and becomes deeply political. Shortage has exposed the fragility of Crimea's dependence on narrow, vulnerable supply routes controlled by Moscow. Fuel distribution, which once operated quietly in the background, has now moved to center stage as residents begin to understand the extent to which their stability is tied to a system currently stretched beyond its limits. The sudden disappearance of a commodity as essential as gasoline affects not just mobility, but the rhythm of everyday life. Commutes, emergency services, commercial deliveries, and public transport have all been disrupted. The crisis is no longer simply about stalled cars. It is about a region slowing to a halt. The psychological impact is equally significant. Long queues at gas stations have become a symbol of public anxiety, a visible reminder that the authorities are struggling to meet even the most basic needs. Residents are increasingly turning to alternative methods of travel, hoarding fuel when they can, and openly expressing distrust toward official reassurances. When the state cannot guarantee something as fundamental as the ability to move, people begin to question what else might fail next. This is another powerful hook. A government's legitimacy is often judged not by its rhetoric, but by the mundane services it can keep functioning. Beyond the daily frustrations, the crisis threatens the broader economic landscape. Businesses relying on transport are facing delays, increased costs, and supply shortages. Prices for essential goods risk climbing as delivery trucks reduce routes or halt operations. Informal markets have begun to emerge, offering fuel at inflated prices and further undermining official control. These developments position the crisis not as a temporary inconvenience, but as a deepening structural problem, one that erodes public confidence and weakens the claim that Crimea remains firmly under stable governance. The unfolding fuel scarcity reveals a deeper truth. Disruptions in essential commodities can destabilize a region far faster than political speeches or symbolic infrastructure. The gasoline crisis is not just a technical failure, it is a warning sign of a system under strain, and its consequences will echo far beyond the gas stations now running dry. The growing wave of residents leaving Crimea has become one of the most telling indicators of a region under severe strain, revealing a level of public uncertainty that Moscow can no longer disguise. The exodus is not dramatic in spectacle, but it is powerful in meaning. Families packing their belongings, workers abandoning jobs they once thought stable, and even those tied to local administration quietly seeking safer ground. The movement of people is often the clearest signal of how a population truly interprets its circumstances, and in Crimea, that interpretation is unmistakably grim. Here is the hook. When citizens vote with their feet, it represents a level of distrust more forceful than any protest. This flight is not occurring in isolation. It is the cumulative result of compounded pressures. The gasoline crisis, damaged infrastructure, rising prices, and a sense that the future is tightening rather than expanding. What begins as a shortage of fuel quickly becomes a shortage of confidence. When residents see gas stations shuttered, supply trucks stalled, and essential services strained, the logic becomes simple. If the basics are cracking now, what will happen next month or next year? The instinct to move is not just emotional, it is rational, a response to a deteriorating landscape where the state's promises feel increasingly hollow. The demographic shift carries profound implications. Each departure decreases the number of skilled workers, teachers, technicians, and drivers who keep everyday life functioning. The loss of families weakens local economies, disrupts schools, and empties communities that once thrived. The quiet but steady movement outward exposes a truth that official statements cannot camouflage. People do not flee regions they believe are stable. This is a powerful hook because it turns the narrative of control on its head. Instead of demonstrating security, Crimea's shrinking population underscores vulnerability. Moreover, this population movement creates a feedback loop. As more residents leave, those who remain face worsening service shortages, longer queues for dwindling resources, and a greater burden on minimal infrastructure. This only amplifies the desire to evacuate, accelerating the unraveling of community cohesion. Rumors spread faster, fears escalate, and the sense of living in a place at risk grows stronger. In regions marked by political tension, perception becomes as influential as reality. The perception now is clear. Crimea is no longer a place where the future feels predictable. The departures tell a deeper story about the fragility of imposed stability. The region's population shift is more than a demographic trend. It is a political verdict delivered by the people most affected. And when the public's verdict contradicts official narratives, the consequences reach far beyond the borders of Crimea itself. Ukrainian strikes on Russian supply lines, particularly the targeted drone attacks on refineries and logistical hubs, have emerged as one of the most consequential developments shaping the crisis in Crimea. These operations are not random disruptions, but carefully calibrated blows aimed at the heart of Moscow's ability to sustain its presence in the region. By degrading Russia's refining capacity and complicating the transport of fuel, these strikes have transformed what once seemed like a secure logistical network into a fragile, overstretched system. And here is the hook. When a military power's supply lines become its vulnerabilities, the entire illusion of stability begins to falter. The strikes have exposed a significant strategic imbalance. Russia's hold over Crimea depends heavily on a limited number of supply routes that now face constant risk of interception, delay, or destruction. Refineries deep inside Russian territory, which were previously viewed as untouchable, have proven vulnerable to long-range drones. Every refinery taken offline reduces fuel output, and every supply convoy delayed adds pressure to an already strained system. This cumulative impact is not merely disruptive, it reshapes the entire logistics map on which Crimea depends. For residents and local authorities in Crimea, the consequences are immediate and tangible. The fuel shortages triggered by disrupted refinery production have rippled outward, emptying gas stations, slowing transportation networks, and undermining public services. The strikes have effectively forced Crimea into a precarious state of dependency on unstable supply chains. This instability magnifies the perception that Moscow cannot guarantee the basic economic and infrastructural support required to maintain daily life. Another powerful hook emerges here. When external pressure exposes internal weakness, the political narrative collapses from within. From a strategic standpoint, these strikes serve as a reminder that modern warfare is no longer defined solely by frontline clashes. Disrupting fuel supply can immobilize vehicles, limit troop movement, delay essential deliveries, and paralyze civilian infrastructure. The battlefield now extends into energy systems, logistics hubs, and industrial choke points. Ukraine's ability to target these nodes undermines Russia's operational flexibility and creates cascading effects on everything from military readiness to public confidence. Furthermore, the psychological impact cannot be overstated. The knowledge that critical infrastructure can be struck at any time generates uncertainty, and uncertainty erodes a sense of control that occupying powers work hard to project. Every successful strike signals to residents that the situation is neither secure nor stable, intensifying anxieties and fueling broader doubts about the long-term sustainability of Russian governance in Crimea. In this context, Ukrainian strikes are not merely tactical maneuvers. They are strategic disruptions shaping the political, economic, and emotional landscape of the region. Their significance lies not only in the damage they inflict, but in the deeper cracks they reveal. The emergence of black markets and the rising threat of corruption in Crimea have become defining features of the region's deepening fuel crisis, revealing an undercurrent of economic instability that thrives whenever official structures begin to falter. As gas stations shut their pumps and formal supply lines fail to meet demand, an alternative economy has taken hold, one operating in the shadows, where gasoline is sold at inflated prices and access is determined not by fairness, but by connections and cash. And here is the hook. Whenever essential goods slip out of state control, so does the narrative of authority that governments work tirelessly to maintain. What makes this development particularly telling is the speed with which these informal networks have grown. In any region facing scarcity, opportunists move quickly to exploit gaps in supply, but the swiftness and scale seen in Crimea reflect a broader erosion of institutional oversight. Residents report that fuel is being hoarded, resold from hidden reserves, or transported secretly across stretches of road designed to evade official checkpoints. This behavior signals a profound loss of confidence in the state's ability to resolve the crisis. When people believe the system won't deliver, they create a new one, however flawed, on their own. The proliferation of black markets also exposes the vulnerabilities of a region already strained by war, political tension, and logistical disruption. Corruption thrives where transparency is absent, and in Crimea, the conditions for such activity have never been more fertile. Local officials, faced with insufficient resources and mounting pressure, may turn a blind eye or even participate in illicit trade. Truck drivers who once operated within regulated routes now face incentives to divert part of their cargo. The crisis has blurred the line between survival and exploitation. A powerful hook emerges here when corruption becomes a necessity for some and an opportunity for others. The entire economic foundation begins to crack. Beyond the immediate economic distortions, the spread of black markets carries serious social consequences. Inequality intensifies as those with money or influence obtain what they need, while ordinary citizens wait in hours-long lines only to find empty pumps. Trust erodes between neighbors, between citizens and authorities, and between communities that once relied on shared systems. The feeling that the rules no longer apply breeds resentment, fear, and a sense of abandonment. This widening gap between official policy and lived reality reveals a deeper political challenge. Black markets are not just signs of scarcity. They are symptoms of a governance structure losing its grip on essential sectors. In Crimea's current crisis, they represent more than just illicit trade. They highlight the breakdown of the very mechanisms meant to sustain order. When the underground becomes more reliable than the state, the stability of the region is no longer dictated by policy, but by survival instincts. The strategic and political consequences of the crisis in Crimea are becoming impossible for Moscow to conceal, as each new failure in infrastructure or supply challenges the very narrative of stability that the Kremlin has worked to project since the annexation. The fuel shortages, logistical breakdowns, and civilian departures do not exist in a vacuum. They are reshaping the political landscape and exposing weaknesses that cannot be dismissed as temporary disruptions. And here is the hook. When a government built on the image of control begins to lose control, the political fallout often arrives faster than the leaders expect. The situation in Crimea now serves as a stress test for Moscow's long-standing claim that the region is fully integrated and securely under its governance. Instead of demonstrating strength, the crisis is revealing the fragility of that claim. Each gas station running dry, each convoy delayed, and each family choosing to leave weakens the perception that Russia can protect and provide for those living under its authority. In geopolitics, perception is not a side note. It is a form of power. The erosion of public confidence becomes in itself a political event. Internationally, the crisis undermines Russia's strategic posture. A region it once showcased as a political triumph is now becoming a symbol of strain and vulnerability. The inability to maintain stable supply lines and basic economic functions raises questions about Moscow's long-term capacity to hold Crimea, not just militarily, but administratively and economically. Allies observe these developments cautiously, while adversaries interpret them as signs that sustained pressure can yield meaningful results. For Ukraine and its supporters, the instability serves as confirmation that the costs of occupation are mounting for Russia. This is another powerful hook. When a symbol of victory becomes a liability, the geopolitical narrative shifts. Domestically, the consequences may be even more significant. Russian citizens who once supported the annexation as a historic and strategic success are now confronted with images of scarcity, chaos, and uncertainty in a region the government promised would flourish under its rule. This contradiction forces a reevaluation of the Kremlin's assurances, not just about Crimea, but about Russia's broader economic and military capabilities. Trust, once compromised, is difficult to regain. Within Crimea itself, the crisis is accelerating political fatigue. Residents who once tolerated the burdens of occupation in exchange for promises of stability are now questioning whether those promises hold any value. As daily life becomes harder, the population becomes more receptive to doubt, to rumor, and to alternative futures. Political control relies not only on force, but on the belief that the authority in place can provide safety and predictability. The unfolding crisis challenges both. In this environment, every shortage, every disrupted delivery, and every family choosing to flee contributes to a narrative that Moscow cannot afford to ignore. The stability of Crimea is weakening, and with it, a central pillar of Russia's geopolitical identity. In closing, let me be very clear. This is a turning point. We are witnessing the unraveling of a narrative that Moscow has long touted, that Crimea is irrevocably and permanently integrated into Russia. But when logistics fall apart and when people no longer feel safe or supported, that narrative becomes hollow. The gasoline crisis in Crimea is more than an economic squeeze. It is a political stress test. And in that test, the land bridge, once the backbone of Moscow's grip, is weakening under the pressure of war, sabotage, and resource scarcity. Let us watch this moment carefully, because how Russia responds now, whether it finds a way to restore supply, or whether it doubles down in repression, or even retreats in symbolic ways, may tell us more about the future of its grip on Crimea than any military engagement ever will. Thank you.